Sam Bidwell, welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Not at all. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Sam, you are making waves, I would say, at least not just in conservative media, but media more broadly, which is because you have this very clear-eyed policy analysis. And as we were talking before the show, I think I phrased it that you are quite good at pointing out where the British state continues to flounder on topics of housing and immigration and more broadly, the social contract. And I think that's a good place to start. Immigration is something that is being spoken about all over the Western world. Electorates have for many years been trying to vote in a way that reduces it, and it hasn't happened. And indeed in Britain, we have seen huge numbers come, not just since the beginning of the Blair premiership back in 1997 and Cameron's government coming in 2010, but particularly under Boris Johnson's leadership and what is now being called the Boris wave. Such are the giant numbers. And indeed, I think one of the most recent years of records, which had initially been estimated of 708,000 net immigrants, which had deducted the 500,000 who had left the country, has now been revised upwards to closer to 920,000-30,000. And there's this feeling that over the last 5 years, we might have welcomed in up to 6 million new people into the country. From where you're standing, Sam, what does the Boris wave and perhaps even more repeated waves post-Boris mean for the social contract in Britain?
Sure. Thanks so much. That was an unnecessarily glowing intro. You didn't give far too much credit. Look, the social contract point is really salient, and there are a couple of things at play here. First thing at play is democracy. So one of the basic expectations of the social contract in a democratic society is that when you vote, you're broadly listened to. And no government has won an election since at least 1974 on a promise of higher migration. No one has ever won on a promise of higher migration, and everybody since 74 has explicitly promised lower migration. Right? So it's not about reading the tea leaves. We know exactly what people think and what people want. Politicians can't say that the public hasn't got a clear will on this. And that, at the basic level, that's kind of step one of where the social contract's going wrong, is that people have been promised that if you vote for things repeatedly, you'll get them, and they haven't. There's also a deeper problem around the social contract. You may have seen this kind of internet meme that floats around, Nicolas Sertillon, the kind of beleaguered French professional. And the idea is basically that hardworking, working-age taxpayers are being taxed to fund services that they're not using. That's a mixture of things like the state pension, which we know now is unsustainable. It was based on the idea that each successive generation would be larger than the previous. That now isn't the case because of things like low birth rates. It's a lot of that money is also going to welfare and to social housing and to economically inactive people. You mentioned that Boris wave. So really starting in 2021, we've seen a massive uptick. We were already at very high levels. We were already bringing in net hundreds of thousands of people a year. We're now bringing in net upwards of 700,000 people a year. I prefer the gross figure because I think it really drives home how big the wave has been. It's been at least 4.5 million people over 4 years. So at least a city the population of Birmingham every year. The result of that, right, we're told it's going to be great for the economy, and of course it hasn't been. The economy's flatlined while immigration has skyrocketed. And the reason is that we're not bringing in very high-skilled, very hard-working, tax-paying, go-getting migrants from America or from Europe. Our migration mix has actually changed as well since Brexit. Because of the rules, post-Brexit rules and the way that those rules have changed, we've seen a massive uptick in non-EU migration. 1 million Indians in the last 4 years, several 100,000 people from Pakistan, from Nigeria, from Bangladesh, etc. And we know that those people are likely over their lifetimes to be not be net contributors, to be net detractors from the state, particularly if they bring dependents, which many of them do. Many of them bring family members over. Many of them are from countries where it's not normal for women to work. So we're talking about you come over, you do 5 years of work, you get what's called indefinite leave to remain. That's the settlement status. You are then entitled to claim welfare, social housing, to use the NHS, to bring over dependents, etc. That is being funded by hardworking young professionals in cities like London, in cities like Edinburgh, etc. That is the social contract turned on its head. And there's one more aspect to this as well. If things couldn't get even worse, believe me, they can. It's the British state we're talking about. Crime is a basic one, right? Crime and the way that we enforce laws. We are stricter than ever on law-abiding citizens, whether that's on things like speech or anybody with a white. I've got a friend trying to get married to an American girl, very nice, very high earning, etc. The Home Office has given him hell. He's had to go through numerous hoops and clear numerous hurdles, etc. If he'd come over on a small boat and then wanted to bring his family 5 years later, he would have had no problem whatsoever. So that's the other aspect of the social contract that's going wrong, this whole anarcho-tyranny dimension, which is that the state is kind of tyrannical towards the most law-abiding citizens, but fairly anarchic when it comes to enforcing the law against the least law-abiding.
Why do you think there isn't as much public uproar about these things as you'd expect? I mean, I could probably make slightly snide comments about, well, people will just get locked up if they do, but that won't be helpful. But you would think that given there is this clear distinction being drawn between the law-abiding and those who aren't, and potentially even, just to put a finer point on it, those not born in the country being given preferential treatment over those born in the country, or seeking to marry those who are more culturally aligned. Is the reason why there's less said about this because we have a taboo that governs us? I know Eric Kaufman talks about it. People are just afraid to talk about things like differences in race and culture because of the potential social consequences to that, and also for those who truly believe in the sacralization of those groups. Is that part of it, or is it simply it's just not in the public mind for whatever reason?
So I think the public do talk about it. I mean, I grew up in a kind of ex-brick-making town in North Wales. Right? People there talk about it, believe me. Right? They watch TV News, they read the newspapers, they see the cases, they're outraged. You will often hear people say, make comments like, I'm not endorsing the comment, but you will hear people make comments like, you couldn't build a church in Saudi Arabia, why can you build a mosque in this country? That's something I've heard from normal members of the public numerous times. So the idea of unequal treatment is actually, it's very widely felt. The problem is political. It's that those norms are so distant from the kind of norms that govern political life here in Britain. We have we have quite a closed political culture in terms of what's regarded as acceptable in that world. We have a media that is very good at gatekeeping. It's gotten less good at gatekeeping of time, and I think that's why they're worried about things like online safety. They're concerned about the power that the internet gives ordinary people to access and voice these views. Things like GB News as well. I mean, look at how Ofcom has behaved around GB News, trying to shut the channel down, sanction it for bringing on Rishi Sunak, to discuss his views with members of the public. Lest we forget that on Good Morning Britain, at the height of the riots over the summer, we had Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, interviewed by her husband, Ed Balls. It's not actually about whether these news channels are politically impartial. I think there is a genuinely political angle to the way that some of our regulators behave that is allowed, is enabled by the political and ethical norms of people who govern us. It is only that the public has been talking about this stuff for so long and that it's gotten so bad that people are starting to act on it. And we're seeing in the polls, Reform doing very well. People, even the Conservative Party has come a long way over the last decade in terms of the way it talks about these things. You wouldn't see David Cameron talking about some of the things that frontbench Conservative MPs now talk about. And even the Prime Minister, even Keir Starmer, has accepted what he calls open borders experiment, accepted that was wrong. So we're moving, I'm not going to say inexorably, but we're moving slowly in the right direction. But it's not because the public is waking up to this, right? The public, I think, is actually fairly aware. It's the problem is politicians. And, the other side of that coin is that even those politicians which have advocated for the public mood on this question or on this set of questions have been very bad at thinking about it in systemic terms. they've thought about it primarily in individual terms. So they look at, I read a thread yesterday about a Turkish drug dealer who was told that Home Office was told they couldn't deport the man because it would interrupt his right to a family life. So, it's very easy to kind of get annoyed about that case because it's clearly a terrible decision that's going to have a negative impact on the country and on the level of safety that we have in the country. But even politicians who've been willing to say that have been very poor at identifying the underlying structural factors, right? A lot of this stuff is legislative. It's the law. I often say this about free speech too. That is the law. The law should be different, but it is the law. And advocates in Westminster, such that they are only just now catching up to some of the structural causes of things like high migration, the transfer of wealth from working age people to people from abroad, etc., etc.
We'll stay on immigration for a bit longer. The point you made about Keir Starmer's speech after those immigration figures were revised upwards from north of 700,000 in the year to north of 900,000 in the year, where he said it's an open border experiment. And this has added fuel to what you could say are quite common online right talking points, that replacement migration is going on as the demographics in the country change. But indeed, it's not just the online right. There are many who are unhappy with open borders, including immigrants and the descendants of immigrants themselves. And so I'm even spotting it amongst the so-called political normies who would typically get their information from BBC News, ITV News, and The Times, and things, publications and broadcasting organisations that would typically toe the line and not stray too far from whatever is deemed to be polite opinion. So you can almost feel that shift. I know you've talked about various policy instruments that might be pulled upon to deal with some of these waves of immigrants. What are they?
Sure. So let's take it back to the structural. So there are some really big things. I think we have to think really seriously about the human rights architecture we've got. That's broadly more of a problem with illegal, but there is still a problem sometimes with deportation of foreign criminals based on who come legally and then commit crime. So our human rights infrastructure has to change. That's the Human Rights Act. There are some elements of the Equality Act that have an implication there. The tribunal system that we have around immigration cases also is clearly in need of reform. But the most fundamental thing that I think we need to do, we do need to bring down the numbers. I think a parliamentary set cap is a crude way of doing it, but a way that would be broadly effective. And I think keep it, given the current crop of parliamentarians that we've got, keep it crude and easy. But there are also some short-term things that we need to start thinking about. So the current assumption of our migration system was built at a time when we had very few people coming in. The assumption, therefore, was that they would all want to become citizens and that they could all become citizens. Let's remember, when we're talking about tens of thousands of people a year, as we were at the beginning of the 20th century, then, okay, maybe your working assumption can be that people are going to come, they're going to do a bit of work, they're going to settle, and then they're going to become citizens. Immigration is at its most harmful when it is linked to citizenship. Because what it does is it bakes in some of those decisions that policymakers make. So let's say we give you a visa at this moment in time, give you a work visa, 5 years. The automatic track that you're on is now as follows. 5 years, and then you can access what's called indefinite leave to remain. That gives you access to welfare, to social housing, waiting lists, to healthcare, etc. You're then on the path to citizenship. So you're on the path to being able to stay here permanently, and you can bring your family. That's just 5 years of work. So this is, as a certain American president would say, this is the worst deal in the history of deals, maybe ever, right? You come for 5 years, you do 5 years of low-skilled work, and then you can access the state support forever, and you could potentially become a voting citizen. In many cases, you're already a voting citizen because Commonwealth citizens could vote in the UK as well. So Indians who've come over the last 4 years could all vote automatically in UK elections. 1 million people, right? It's not a small number. 1 million new voters. in fact, it's more because you've got people coming from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from Nigeria. So we've probably added about 2 million new voters over the last couple of years, all from abroad, all with very few ties to the nation that they are then going to be electing the representatives of. So, I mean, the thing you could do on day one is end Commonwealth voting. Clearly, that's inappropriate. It was, again, a rule designed at the time when the Commonwealth migrants were primarily, a small number coming from Canada or from Australia, countries that had existed for about 5 minutes and were full of British people. So we're talking about a very different Commonwealth now. We're also talking about a very different immigration situation now. Second thing you could do, and this has been my big campaign at the moment, is you could just extend that ILR period. You could just say, okay, rather than 5 years indefinitely to remain, it's going to take 50. And if we want to take your visa away, we can. Because when you get that 5-year visa, there is no term or condition which says that visa has to be reissued ad infinitum if circumstances change. If we decide that we don't want somebody to come and work in a coffee shop for the next 15 years and then become a citizen and bring their family, cost the taxpayer hundreds of thousands of pounds over their lifetime, then we can just revoke that visa. We don't have to reissue it, right? You have no automatic rights to remain in the UK for the rest of your life. That is how immigration looks in large parts of the world. There is a severance between settlement, citizenship, and a visa. There is no access to state services whatsoever, and the overall numbers are lower. So I'm thinking of a country like Singapore. Singapore is a classic example of a great social contract which works fabulously. Ordinary Singaporeans feel that they're represented, even though many will say that it's not a democratic society. There is great popular support for the political settlement in that country, and certainly in economic terms, they're having a pretty good time. They do use guest labourers from Vietnam or from the other ASEAN countries, the Philippines, Indonesia, etc. And you go and you see it. You see people from the rest of Southeast Asia working in Singapore. They are there because a business has sponsored them to come there. If that person breaks their immigration conditions or they commit a crime, the business is fined and the person goes home. Right? Guess what? The immigration there is more orderly, right? Because businesses are incentivized to be really careful about who they're bringing over. You can't bring dependents. You don't have access to state support, so you've got to be fairly self-reliant. And actually, there is no link whatsoever because they're very precious about the nature of their country, which is very delicate and which has caused them problems before. So they're very cautious around it. Japanese are the same. It's actually the same in countries like the UAE, Dubai. Right, majority of the population of Dubai are immigrants, but not citizens. The path to citizenship is very limited. What that does is it gives the political community that makes up the core of the nation state continued power over that nation state. Right? It stops the dilution of citizenship, and it stops immigration from being long-term harmful, and actually, in many ways, allows those countries to be more immigration liberal, but within strict confines.
The citizenship point is remarkable when you see how easily Britain gives out citizenship. I came across, it might have been in one of your articles, so I will caveat that in case I'm incorrectly sourcing this information, but side-by-side comparison with Japan, we know culturally a very different beast, but since the 1870s, I think, they have given out 600,000 citizenships, so naturalized Japanese citizens, whereas in the last 4 years, I think, maybe 5 years, Britain has given out 1.8 million
I think
citizenships.
That was
it yours?
Yeah, I think it was my tweet. So
yes.
There you go. You're right. You'll be pleased to hear.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad it was definitely yours. I'm also glad I got it right, and I wasn't spewing rubbish. I also am struck by, and let me know if you think this is also the case. I appreciate that there are lots of people who see the issue, and as you mentioned in your northern Welsh town, where I'm from in Northumberland, people typically say it how it is, and there's that big disconnect between not just the SW1 Westminster bubble, but just about anyone who passes as a cultural elite, liberal metropolitan, and just about everyone else. But what's interesting when you speak to people about the scale of immigration is it's almost become so normal to have such large numbers of people come in, and also to talk about something called immigration policy, that people see it as an engineering problem. And if only we could build more houses, then it's fine. Then we wouldn't have the competition for the houses, and it shouldn't really matter. And I don't know how they've become blinded by the cultural points and then the points you've raised, which is ultimately you're enfranchising people who may have very different interests and objectives that run counter to what a British state might want to achieve for its citizens. But it also makes me wonder why no one seems to actually ask what a country is for and what a country is. I don't quite understand why people think the solution is just to tarmac over more of England and build more housing estates. When you obviously spend quite a lot of time around the political class, do you, besides those who are more conservatively inclined, do you ever really get a sense that anyone asks that question, or have they become blind to what makes a country, and specifically this country, and it's all just an engineering problem?
It's a really interesting question. I think for most people, the nation is a kind of economic unit. That's the primary way in which they think about the nation. I mean, it's worth remembering, just on one of the points you made there, if you poll people or ask how many migrants they think have come over in the last 5 years, right, the figure is like 100,000. People have got no idea, right? We're really talking about a public that is really angry about immigration and thinks that immigration is far lower than it is. So if that message were effectively communicated about the real scale, just imagine the tide of public opinion against the current policy that we've got. In terms of that question about the nation, most thinkers, most political thinkers, whether that's politicians, journalists, whatever, don't think about the nation state in those terms whatsoever, if they think about the nation state at all. There are those on the left who think about the nation state in terms of economics, but through a slightly different lens. They think about it through the lens of workers, and many of them will accept the legitimacy of borders. Lest we forget that there are passages of Marx where he excoriates the impact of Irish migration on English workers. So there is a kind of Marxist case there for border control. But the vast majority of people don't think about it in those terms whatsoever. They think in purely economic terms. And I say this as somebody who works for a free market think tank. Right? I care a lot about economics. I do think we need to be building more. I am a kind of an economic liberal in some ways, in many ways. But I still have a very acute sense of the nation state, partly because I think that our tradition of economic and social and political liberalism is a feature of our national characteristics, right? It's not random, and nor is it intellectual. We didn't come at it through liberal philosophy. We have norms which lend themselves towards what we then post hoc call liberalism. That isn't true for most people in politics. They think first about whether we should be, if they're thinking about this stuff at all, whether we should be a country that is liberal, a country that is socialist, etc. But we think about that through a primarily economic lens. What grows the GDP line? Actually, most of them are not even thinking about that. They're thinking about their particular policy bugbears, like, if you work in healthcare policy, all you're thinking about is how do you get the waiting list down, right? And you don't need to therefore think about the wider implications of, okay, so if we bring in healthcare workers and then they settle, what are the impacts on the nation state as a whole? They're just thinking, well, as long as it gets the waiting list down, I've done my job, right? And I tick the box. So there's a lot of siloed thinking. Right? And of course, a nation is hard to conceptualize because it's lots of different silos. It's hundreds of different silos, communities, sectors, policy areas, etc. The number of people thinking holistically about this within the Westminster space is small. They are there, I promise, but there are not very many of them.
You made a point there, which I think references someone that we both admire, and indeed has been a guest on this show, Professor Alan McFarlane, who, when we spoke, he made the case that, culture is the thing that creates technological take-up, advancement, political systems. And so anything that we look at in the modern world and the various isms that have sprouted from it, whether it's liberalism, as you just pointed out, is because these were part of the natural English settlement, and then as England and then Britain expanded its influence, these things were exported. But the ability to be able to make all of these great inventions and political ideas and the various contributions to the Enlightenment were downstream of English and British sensibilities. This is a concern of, I wouldn't just say the online right. I think there are economic liberals like Garrett Jones, for example, who's written The Culture Transplant, makes the point that culture has a long tail, and it lasts for generations. So if you have different peoples from different areas moving into countries, how economically viable they are, or the contributions they make, or the kind of businesses they even set up, is directly linked to their culture. And I suppose where am I going with this, Sam, is if we have demographic change taking place on a large scale. So you talked about 1 million Indians in the last 4 years. We've gotten large numbers of Nigerians and Pakistanis. I think we're currently at around 80% white British as a country as a whole, but that's 36% in London. Is if we're saying that political sensibilities, economic systems are downstream of culture, and we know that large numbers of peoples equals culture, then let's think about some of the other reality about whether we can move the dial on some of the immigration questions you've talked about, because we've got a Home Office that has multicultural networks. One of them is a 700 strong Muslim activist base who are trying to change Home Office policy for Muslim needs. We've even got a leader of the opposition who is proudly Yoruba Nigerian and has spoken about wanting to have more people like her around. So she wants to open those doors. I'm not saying she said that recently, but that's a paraphrase. I suppose if we are seeing different peoples advocating for their own interests and large-scale demographic change, the collapse within birth rates, here's the killer question, which everyone always intimates in a doomerist way online, which is like, Britain's finished, but in a slightly less hyperbolic tone. Is there a risk here that because of all of those factors, that in, say, 50 years' time when the demographics have changed so much, that our political institutions may well, and their economics, our culture, may look totally unrecognizable?
There's always a risk. There's always been a risk, right? Throughout all of history, there has always been a risk. The risk now is greater for various reasons, but the reason that we've been able to have a successful country for a millennium is because we've been very careful with it, and we've been very cautious, and we've been very good at resisting invasion. As Professor McFarlane rightly identifies, one of the peculiar features of England and of Britain in general is that we've had a very high level of internal migration, like people moving from Warwickshire to London to work in the 1400s, etc., but a very low level of external migration. So high internal churn, but effectively, for most of history, very little external migration. Of course, there's a huge risk, and we're already seeing it, right? It's not that this is a prospective risk. This is something that is happening. And what we can do is we can slow it or we can reverse it, but it's already happening. And I'll give you some examples. I wrote an article at the beginning of the last general election campaign arguing that at least 4 seats would flip to Muslim independents who are campaigning primarily with an eye on the Muslim community rather than on making broad national prescriptions. Independent candidates running against the Labour Party. I was told that I was being hyperbolic, and that actually, in these communities, the Labour Party was strong, these were people who cared about social democratic ideas, etc. Guess what? Guess what happened on election night? Right? Exactly the 4 seats that I identified flipped. There were a number of others where it was run really, really close. Jess Phillips' seat in Birmingham, Hillside North, which is where Wes Streeting lives, a number of others, high-profile Labour figures, including the Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood in another part of Birmingham. Those MPs, we have already seen this in this Parliament. They do not fit the ideological norms of British politics. These are people who voted for the retention of VAT carve-outs for independent schools, because Muslim schools benefit from those carve-outs. That's traditionally a right-wing idea. But they've also voted against restrictions on cousin marriage, which is not a very right-wing idea in the current political climate. The reason is that they are appealing to a particular community. Their norms align with those of a particular community. Generally, it's Pakistani Muslims in the 4 cases that we can identify here, but it's not exclusively. In East London, I encourage everybody to go away and read about Tower Hamlets and what's happening in Tower Hamlets, a borough that is now 36% Bangladeshi by origin, and where Bangladeshi patronage networks are beginning or have begun for the last decade or so to influence the way that government happens at a local level. You may be interested to know that, while Tower Hamlets is the most corrupt part of Britain, it's probably the least corrupt part of Bangladesh, right? On that cultural transfer point. Of course, its political culture is going to look more like the home country of those who've come over, because at that scale, there can be no integration. It's not like we're talking about the Huguenots here, who came to England, very small numbers, over a very long period of time, spread out very thinly, and therefore integrated. You could know, and most people listening almost certainly could not identify who was Huguenot and who was not. You could probably identify who had come to the country in the last couple of years. Right? That you probably could have a decent guess at that. And that is because we are talking about not just cultural change, but cultural transfer. Some of these communities are now so segregated from the norm in terms of not just the population and where they're living, but the services that they access. So schools becoming majority or plurality one community, healthcare services, tailoring themselves to meet the needs of that community, the media markets that they're engaging with, right? A lot of the reason that I was called hysterical for predicting this big wave of Muslim independent support was that most people in the mainstream press don't interact with Muslim media. They don't engage with it, right? And nor do most Muslims in these communities engage with the mainstream media, right? We created it is a 2-pillar society. And in fact, it's more than 2 pillars. It's many pillars, some of which larger than others. It's not just, there is a tendency, I think, on the right to pick on the Muslim community. Not the case. There are now areas of the country where the Indian community, primarily Hindu, is starting to exercise serious influence over politics. In Harrow, 1922 committee chairman Bob Blackman, so the most senior backbencher in the Conservative Party, wins despite the fact that his constituency is about 55-60% Indian. And he does so by doing things like hosting rallies for Narendra Modi in London. So it cuts across a number of communities now. We are seeing, not prospectively, we are currently seeing cultural transfer from certain other countries to this country as a result of mass migration. It will get worse if, first of all, if the immigration wave continues, but secondly, if we don't sever that link between immigration and citizenship, or indeed that vote between Commonwealth citizenship and voting, those 2 links will help to drive and deepen that change pretty rapidly over the next couple of years.
The examples of these cultural transfers you talked about are abound, and as you mentioned, it isn't strictly concentrated on Muslim communities. Indeed, I was reading the other day about how there's a Sikh justice system that also operates within the country, and this again is a bit of an online talking point. But thinking about the concentrations of these different peoples that are now making up the majority of lots of former industrial towns in the north. We obviously have lots of our big cities, including our second city, including London to a degree. An online talking point is that we've got a bit of a Danelaw situation going on here with a fragmented country, and clearly that was before the formation of England proper. But going off into the future, there seems to be probably a quite real possibility of a crisis of legitimacy, where this back to that social contract point, is if you've got lots of different peoples advocating for their own cultural, ethnic, religious interests, and we've got this centralized taxation system which is continuing to see transfers out to different peoples and potentially client groups, that seems like a recipe for political national collapse. And I know it sounds doomerist, but it's happened throughout history. And I suppose, again, as someone who spends time around SW1, certainly more than I do, can we envisage a British state moving towards solutions like the Swedes and the Swiss have, where not only have they started to aim for a kind of net negative migration, and they've started to reduce benefits, reduce the ability to get access to state services, citizenship, but they've also started to revoke citizenship from people who are members of families who've been there for generations and have taken more from what they've paid in. Now, I think when I speak to people, you'll typically be met with, well, this is Britain, we do things differently. I think people envisage those situations as being a very nasty situation, bad for optics. Indeed, Nigel Farage spoke to Winston Marshall about this and said, well, we're not going near deportations or anything like that. We'll alienate people and it's going to look terrible. There's no political will for it to happen. Do you envisage a point when the political class may consider that, or do you think the British way of attempting to govern liberally, even though it's not really doing so at the moment, is so deeply ingrained, the taboo is so ingrained with anyone who is non-white that they would never consider those measures? Or do you think we're seeing the rise of a political sentiment amongst people of all types that will make it unavoidable to make those tough decisions in future?
Well, we're different, but we're not that different, right? We're still a European country facing many of the same pressures as our European peers. Do I think we'll move more slowly on it? Yes, I do. We are already moving more slowly on it. There are all sorts of institutional and cultural reasons for that. But I think we will reach broadly the position of countries like the Netherlands, right? Famously liberal Netherlands, right? The people that we used to look at and say they're crazy liberals, they go too far, right? The Netherlands is there now. It's currently in the process of trying to implement such policies. They have actually, on that ILR point from before, they have moved their settlement period from 5 years to 10 years in the last 6 months. So this is no longer prospective. This is no longer the rise of the right. This is the right beginning to govern. And one way or another, whether that's through the Danish model, where it happens through centre-left party, or whether it's through the more traditional route of the right, policies like these, I think, are essentially not an inevitability. Nothing is ever inevitable in politics, but I can see a world in which we get to that kind of policy environment. And I just think it's worth noting on the Danelaw point, what we have is more like the Ottoman millet system, wherein different communities have parallel institutions like courts, schools, political advocacy organizations, etc. It's worth reflecting that that is the way that the British state has decided to deal with multiculturalism, is to take power over certain communities away from the centralized state and towards minority communities. The difference with the Ottoman millet system is that the majority group in the Ottoman millet system was legally protected, right? Whereas the majority group in the British so-called millet system is taxed more heavily and treated more strictly by the law. Right? And that's not about a particular racial group, it's about a culture. But that culture, the people who are in what you call normal Britain, who engage with Britain through the normal lens of the state, those people are taxed more heavily, or they certainly are more likely to be contributors to tax than detractors. They are certainly treated more strictly by the law. So we have not just a millet system, we have the worst millet system possible, which is wherein your most productive and your most law-abiding group is treated worse than the minority communities. So it's somehow even worse than the Danelaw. Right? We've been here before, but it's somehow even worse. Which I think is why we will move to this sort of policy environment. Look, a lot of people will find it uncomfortable. But what will also be uncomfortable is a world in which the streets are not safe, the economy isn't working, people feel totally alien in their own communities. They feel they've got no control over democratic processes or over border control. that's also a scary world, right? It's not kinder to allow the experiment to continue to be inflicted upon nearly 70 million people. Right? That's by no means kind. In fact, it's a far worse and more pernicious kind of carelessness than it would take to be a little bit callous and a little bit tough and to say, look, we expect a level of participation. We don't want to have the migration system that we've got at the moment, and we certainly don't want to link that migration to citizenship.
Yeah, the experiment you're talking about, I dare say, even if people wouldn't necessarily formulate it in their consciousness that why they left the country, but if we look at the 500,000 people who do leave this country every year, there's every chance it's because they feel like the system is not working in their favour. Indeed, we lose an awful lot of people who are well educated, would be positive contributors to society in many different ways, culturally and economically, and they all go off to the Anglosphere nations, former dominions, and often it's couched because it's weather and job opportunities. But within that, there's the reason why they've had to get to that point, besides wanting to try something new, is because things aren't working here. And maybe that's a place that we turn to now, Sam, which is I spoke with Professor Robert Toombs recently about the notion of decline, national decline. And he actually made a counter argument to the ones you'd see from the likes of Konstantin Kisin on trigonometry, who says, well, we can't stay where Britain is and just decline, look at every metric. And actually, when you do look at basically everything from the Second World War, it has effectively been that trend line. Things are not looking good. And even in this century alone, the metrics suggest that people aren't earning any more money. Houses are a lot more expensive. Taxes are higher. National debt's really high. We spend most of our tax now on the NHS and servicing debt payments, and we don't seem to create that many new jobs. All of those things. Robert Toombs made the point that, well, yeah, but if you still compare us to any other point in history, I mean, we're still within the top 6 richest countries in the world. If you compare us to most countries in the world, we still have a very good standard of living. However, it's also true to say that Britain was once the richest, the healthiest, and the best educated of countries. People can say that was because of the empire, whatever. Why do you think Britain has stagnated so much compared to a great many other countries who haven't experienced the same amount of wage stagnation and the various other issues that we've talked about today?
Sure. So, I mean, look, people's experience of the world is relative. So, I mean, yes, in absolute terms, we'll be richer than we were in 1890, like many, many, many times over. But there is a relative experience point. There are a couple of different ways in which we could say that Britain's declined. So there's been a relative power decline since about the 1920s. It's really crystallized by the Second World War. That's in relation to America, but also in relation to other ascendant powers. And the reason that matters is that it gives us less control over the world around us. So if you're a smaller military or a smaller economy, etc., you have less relative control over what happens in the world around you, which can make you feel that you're not a country that can kind of sway things in its favour. There was a level of inevitability to that. I don't think it was inevitable, but there was a level of inevitability. Britain wouldn't be the undisputed number one forever. And then we made a number of bad choices over the 1920s that really made sure that was going to happen. Chief among them, the Washington Naval Treaty. But that isn't really what people talk about when they talk about decline. There is an economic stagnation, but that really sets in 2008. That's a 2008 problem, and that's a 2008 problem in every Western European country. In fact, we've come out of it probably a little stronger in terms of relative decline to a country like Germany, which is starting to see a precipitous fall in its industrial base. So in economic terms, that stagnation is really a 2008 problem. I mean, unless we forget, in 2007, we had the same per capita GDP as the Americans, and British companies like Vodafone had a bigger market cap than a company like Nvidia. Right? Go away and compare those stock prices now. We were still a serious economic player, and in many ways we still are. Right? The City of London And London as a whole is still a huge financial centre. It's still the capital of global forex trading. It's still a massive market for all sorts of financial services. We're the only European country with a real tech sector. We're third or fourth for capital investment coming from outside the country. We have some very good fundamentals, as well as institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, which aren't going anywhere anytime soon. But what we've done is we've put in place the worst possible policies on top of those good fundamentals. And that has been a choice. At every stage has been a choice. So, our failure to tackle crime has been a choice. Our decisions on mass migration have been a choice. And I think the worst decision of all has been the project of political reordering since 1997, since the Blair years, wherein we've taken power away from ministers who were very, very powerful during the Thatcher and Major years. They had a lot of discretionary power. We've taken power away from them and we've given it to bureaucrats, to quangos. We've gone from about 25 major economic regulators to about 95 over that period. We've got about 500 arm's length bodies, 480 or so, which have power over regulation in different areas of the economy. That makes it very difficult, alongside things like the expansion of human rights law, makes it very difficult for elected politicians to actually do things. So we've as of other countries in Europe, we've gone up, we can't trust the politicians. They got it wrong on 2008. They got it wrong in the 90s, etc. Thatcher was far too harsh. What we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the experts can decide. They're also experts, regulators, courts, quangos, etc. It's gone terribly. It's been an awful decision. And you combine that with our dreadful planning system, which is kind of trying to freeze the country in amber as it was in 1947 when we passed the Town and Country Planning Act. And it's no wonder that nothing happens, right? We've made it hard to build stuff. We're less relatively powerful on the global stage than we were. That was maybe going to happen anyway, but we certainly didn't have to compound it with terrible domestic decisions like we've done time and time again, pretty much every year since 1997.
I wonder how deeply this is a policy problem or whether this is a political class problem. And that sounds like a bit of a banal comment to make, but I was reading a Substack post of Dominic Cummings, which he wrote last December, and it was where he explained how he had spent the last 20 years reading about Bismarck in Germany, the great German statesman that unified the country. This man with the gentle voice but was unbelievably ruthless and was able to bend the world political the political world to his will and create things which no other politician would have dared. And Cummings suggested, well, this is a man who understands human nature and he knew history. And Cummings was explaining how his experience in whether it's Westminster and just politics more broadly, whether it's local or national, is that we're governed by people who are utterly incurious about history. They don't seek to learn the general principles of it. They don't even try to understand how the media works or indeed how politics works. And so you find that we are governed by this herd-like mentality. And it makes me wonder whether the system in which we have now just lends itself to that. I mean, most people who go through the university system end up coming out with a global good view of the world. So every policy has to be about making the world better. And if that means that, we live a little bit less comfortably, then that's fine. It's a good thing. It's our duty. But there doesn't really seem to be any forward thinking. It's all reactive to world events and being truly shocked by an invasion over here or whatever over there. And it makes me wonder whether we are, I know people use the NPC, the non-player character meme, to talk about how this is just how everyday people, they get their political leanings from whatever permission is given by the people on screen or in print. But it almost feels like that's our political class too, that we're governed by NPCs. I don't know how we get out of that.
Oh, well, the general public is far more conscious thinkers than most people in politics. Right? No question about it, because they don't have any of the pretense that comes up around working in politics. There is truth to this. It's a personnel problem. But it's worth remembering it hasn't always been a personnel problem. There has to have been a point where we went from getting the wrong personnel to getting the right personnel to getting the wrong personnel. And to me, again, that goes back to politics. Right? In hiring terms, we hire differently than we used to for things like the civil service. Even since the 1980s, media is a part of it. The way that we engage with media, part of Tony Blair's success was in recognizing that the British media in the late 1990s was actually extraordinarily powerful, because it was the tool through which everybody got their news. And the reason I'm relatively hopeful about whether we start getting the right people in politics and the right ideas in politics over the next, say, decade, is that those institutions are all dying. Right? The old media organizations are all dying. It's now people go online to get their news. There are insurgent offerings like GB News. YouTube is a really important way in which people engage with news and ideas. And I'm always, this idea of incuriosity. Talk to the normal, you will find people out there, hundreds of thousands of them, who engage with really interesting ideas through, whether it's through, could be the Joe Rogan Experience, could be this podcast, could be the rest of history. But this is the way that ideas communicate now. The fact that the rest is history, which is not explicitly political, but it is, let's be real, a kind of curious centre-right, gently centre-right podcast. The fact that they can fill stadiums is pretty interesting. And there's a stadiums full of normal people. They're not full of high intellectuals, academics, whatever. That's normal people who want to engage with history because they find it interesting. We are breaking the media stranglehold, which I think will make it easier for people to access and transmit these ideas, not just radical political ideas, but interesting historical ideas, right? Teaching people about their own national history, teaching them about the world around them. And in doing so, we will make it easier for those of us who are unhappy with the SW1 consensus to start getting into politics in a serious and concerted way.
So I've been meaning to create a testimonial page for my podcast to say what people have been saying about it and bring more subscribers in. And I'm absolutely lifting up the section where you sandwich thinking class in between the Joe Rogan Experience and the rest is history. Sam, I've really enjoyed our discussion today. We covered a lot of ground. The one question I like to ask every one of my guests to really get into their mind and how they ended up where they are, but also just how things have changed for them, is if there's anything in your life that you changed your mind about that you once thought was a universal truth, absolutely set in stone, but that changed. What was it that made you change your mind?
Look, I've always been, the kind of founding idea of my politics has always been the nation state. I've always been nationalist. I've always cared about immigration. My kind of first political moment was Brexit, really, and support for Brexit. I've become less statist over time. I wasn't, if you spoke to me at the beginning of my university tenure, I was a bit more of a big stater. I thought, states are very powerful organizations. They can do an awful lot. And they still can, right? They can, but what I've come to through the study of history, through the study of places like 20th century Hong Kong, Singapore, even contemporary examples like Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, what I've come to see is over time, states should focus on doing a few things very well rather than lots of things in a kind of middling way. Over time I've become probably more, I don't like the term libertarian or classical liberal, but I've become less of a believer that state power is always the way to solve problems.
Interesting. I often try and grapple with that myself. I seem to fluctuate between the need to have some kind of government intervention, but then when I find myself trying to figure out where that ought to be, I really struggle. And then on the same side of things, I realize that by having a really, really small one, that things can be ineffective. I suppose I always grapple with the local and the central government. There are times where I think, we could do with the power of the states of the US, the ability to make your own decisions for your own region because you live there and probably understand it a bit more. And then at the same token, look at the impact of devolution on this country.
I was going to say you're in Scotland, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. I'm in Scotland. So it's interesting stuff. I was speaking to Paul Morland on an episode with Ed West, and one of the things he said he changed his mind on was government intervention in various areas. He never considered himself to be a libertarian per se, but in the context of culture, he actually thinks there needs to be a more paternalistic government that safeguards culture. So he was trying to make a few other points which were outside of the realm of deciding all economic policy and the various angles. So with your becoming less statist, where do you think we need state intervention? That's something that should be governed, and where is that you think it should be left more open to emergent cultural norms and what have you?
Sure. I mean, again, I'm not a kind of ideological libertarian. Right? It's empiricism all the way through. So, national security, the border, policing, roads. I think it's a good thing for a state to do. Since the medieval times, the state's always done the king's highway. We probably can't completely undo living in a world where backstops on things like healthcare and pensions are provided by the state, but it doesn't mean that everybody should be receiving primarily their care, whether that's pensions or healthcare, through the state. I think we're seeing the flaws with the current universal model that we've got. Culture is an interesting one. Culture is one of the areas where I've become less statist over time. I think the depressing thing that I've come to realize is that the only way that a culture maintains its own national traditions is by having. I mean, look, Victorians are a great example. The Victorians didn't have arts capital England. Right? It was through the work and support of philanthropists and the third sector that Victorian England and Britain as a whole had a great cultural life and a great civic life. I think it's very hard to be a country that preserves its culture in those very visible ways without also being a growing economy. And I think there are all sorts of ways that the private sector supports a thriving national culture. Philanthropic causes is certainly one of them. But what I don't see as a solution is the state handing out grants of cash, whether directly from ministers or from a kind of quango, in the hopes of kind of keeping the thing alive. Unless people have enough disposable income to go to the theatre, the theatres aren't going to survive. Unless there are enough people who feel that they need to up their own cultural capital, the classic example of those Victorians, once again, who become wealthy from merchant trade or industrialization, and then who feel that to access the real upper class, right, to become not just nouveau riche but riche, they need to start contributing to cultural causes, right? That you go to any opera house anywhere in the country, go to any theatre, go to any community hall, go to lots of our civic spaces, you will find that the bequeathment of a up and coming, the equivalent of the Essex man of the 1800s is what supported the growth of that institution. I think there is very little prospect for a thriving national culture without some level of economic growth.
Absolutely right. I was reading an excellent book by a local historian, local in the context of me being a Northumbrian, called Dan Jackson, and it was called The Northumbrians. And in there, he describes how in 19th century Newcastle, famous, of course, for all of its industry, shipbuilding, coal mining, there was this huge amount of interest in literary affairs. And indeed, there was 4 weekly periodicals, more than any other city in the country, that were being produced every week. And he goes on to talk about how if you went and spoke to the wives of pitmen, you would find, and I noticed this growing up, you would find people of the working classes with these really wide-ranging vocabularies, particularly of the older type. Of course, that's all since gone, but then if you think about the context of Newcastle, effectively it's a place for a boozy night out now. And I hate to diminish it, I love the city, but if you compare the pictures of today with the pictures of back then, even when everyone was hardworking tradesmen, you could see that there was a literary and philosophical society. Yeah, okay, maybe the high society engaged in that, but everyone else was reading the weekly periodicals, and they were regurgitating the words and the ideas within that, and it became a thriving culture. So not long may it continue. Let's hope we can see a return to that somewhere along the line. So I'm with you. I think you do need economic growth for people to decide that they're going to spend their money on things that they find interesting. Sam, I've got a hard stop coming up. I know you've got somewhere to be. It's been an absolute delight speaking to you today. And before I let you go, where can listeners find you, follow you, and what can we expect from you next?
Absolutely. So thanks for having me. It's been a really interesting discussion. I'm on Twitter primarily, so at Sam_Bidwell, Bidwell. I'm also along all the normal Adam Smith Institute channels, and viewers can expect more amateur anthropology about what makes Britain and England in particular so interesting historically. They can also expect some more policy ideas about how we can shrink the size of Britain's sclerotic state.
Sam, it's been a pleasure. Until next time.
Thank you.
To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel at Thinking Class and follow me on X at Thinking Classes. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.